Hello friends, I am Rudraksh Sharma and welcome to my channel JMB Rudraksh Science Classes. So friends, in today's video I am going to discuss the topic Women's Question from the chapter Women's and Reforms. So let's start. First of all, Women's Question. So in the colonial period, so I said the word colonial period. What is the meaning of colonial period? When Britishers ruled India, that period is known as the colonial period, as Britishers, they lived in the colonies. So colonial period is the period in which Britishers, they ruled India and they lived in the colonies, and in the colonial period many middle class professionals were started to grow. Middle class professionals who were very influenced by the Western education. So what is the Western education? It is the education system in the Europe. So the Western education is the education system in the Europe, and the Western education, it helped a lot to eradicate the social evils. So this is the explanation about Women's Question. So the next topic is that reform of the Indian society. So reform of the Indian So the reform of the Indian society is the next topic, and many people thought that it was incomplete until the cause of women was taken up. So this line says that it was like the reform of the Indian society was incomplete until the backward practices which was followed by the women in the colonial period is eradicated or was taken up. It is incomplete until these two things happen, or until the cause of the woman was taken up. Then the Western education, so the Western education, it was very helpful to grow the public consciousness on the topic. So there were three topics on which the Western education grew the public consciousness. The topics were humanism, rationalism. So these are the two public consciousness, or the Western education helped to grow public consciousness, and the third one was the equality. So the Western education helped to grow the public consciousness on the topic humanism, rationalism, and on the topic equality. So now we will discuss British attitude of racial superiority. So British attitude of racial superiority. So we are now going to discuss British attitude of racial superiority, and many Britishers So Many Britishers, they thought that India had a weak social structure. India had a weak social structure. So according to them, Britishers thought that India had a weak social structure. And when the nationalism started growing, when the nationalism started to grow, social reform had started proceeding into the political reform. So earlier there was a social reform, and after that it proceeded and became a political reform. So earlier reforms were socially affecting, and after that the reforms started to affect politically. So next is our opposition to the colonial rule. So opposition to the colonial rule. So now we are going to discuss the topic opposition to colonial rule. And colonial rule thought that Indian society was felt or riddled with two kinds. First were the superstitions, and second one is the backward practices. So as you know that the superstition means andhvishwas, and backward practices contain sati, widow, and etc. And they also said that we can never attain a higher political ideal. So till these practices would be there in the society, we cannot attain a higher. So till the superstition and the backward practices continue, we cannot attain a higher political ideal. So we cannot get a higher political ideal. So this was the explanation on the topic opposition to the colonial rule. So next is the reformers. So the reformers had problems and complications. So reformers had the problems, they had lots of problems, and also they had lots of complications. So who are the reformers? The reformers were the people, those who worked for the betterment of the women in the colonial rule. So the reformers were the people in that time who worked for the betterment of the women in the colonial rule, and there were many reformers. The main difficulty was that they were not agreeing among themselves. So they were not agreeing. They were not agree among themselves. So this was the explanation on the topic reformers. So next is the religious orthodoxy. The religious orthodoxy. So the main two difficulties which were formed or which were faced by the reforms were the religious orthodoxy. The religious orthodoxy denied supporting any effort towards women upliftment. So denied any support for women uplift. So the religious orthodoxy, they were against the reformers, those who were supporting the women for their upliftment. So the religious orthodoxy were against them, and also they said that by doing this it will corrupt our Indian culture. Corrupt our Indian culture. So the religious orthodoxy said that by supporting the women upliftment will corrupt our Indian culture. So these are the reason why the religious orthodoxy was against the reformers. Next was that the campaign for the women's upliftment, the campaign for the women's right, campaign for the women's right, campaign for the women's right, it was there, the campaign was the women's rights were started under the influence of the Western education. So it was influenced by the Western education. So this line says that the campaign for the women's right was started and it was influenced by the Western education. So next is that some reformers thought that there were limited reforms. Many reformers in that time thought that the reforms were very limited, and they also thought that the spread of education will help to achieve this goal. This was the first point. This was the second point. Second, they say that by spreading education, we can achieve our goal. And they also thought that the laws passed by the colonial government, the laws passed by the colonial government will not help to attain this. The laws passed by the colonial government will not help in removing these social evils. Laws by the colonial government will not help to eradicate these practices, will not help to eradicate these practices, or they will not be able to remove the social evils. So these were the 3 points which were thought by the reformers in that time. So in that time, some people thought for the women's Some people thought bad things for the women's, like they thought instead of university degrees, so some thought that instead of university degrees, we should teach them household work. Why? Because this would be helpful for them in the future. Why? As well, if they'll marry, become wife, and she has to control all the house, so she need to know the household chores. That's why some people thought that instead of university degrees, we should teach them the household work. Some in that period, there were two types of women. First of women, they were not ready for the reforms, not prepared for the reforms, but some women actively oppose them. So in women in that time, first woman category was they were not prepared for the reforms, but second was that they actively opposed them. And the reformers in that time, in that colonial period, so I'm talking about the reformers in that period, they had to stop their activities. So they have to stop their activities. There would be some reason why they stopped their activities, because of the family pressure. So their family forced them to stop their activities. So that's why some reformers had to stop their activities, whereas some believed that it was too limited in their scope. It was too limited in their scope and wanted some radical changes. So they wanted some radical changes. So next is that after 1857, so I'm talking about the period after 1857, Britishers abandoned their support to the reformers. Abandoned their support to reformers, as they thought that they were afraid of that it could lead to a rebellion. So that's why they started, or they stopped their support to the reformers. But at the end of the 19th century, the women in the colonial period, they started entering in the public places. Entry in the public places. So they were given entry in the public places which were earlier reserved for the men. So the places which are reserved for the men. So the earlier the places which were reserved for the men, women also started entering in that fields. Next is that women started to educate. So women, they started to educate and working outside and they started working outside and started participating in the politics. So worked outside and participated in politics. As I told you in my early video that women, they were dependent on their male relatives. Now the women had started to work outside, so they were no more depended on male relatives. So from now, or when they started to work outside, they were no more dependent on the male relatives, and they also started to take part in the politics, but their number now also was still low. Educate, and the number was still very low, but this caused, or the end of the 19th century, it signed, like in 19th century, it was a highlighted a new history of Indian women, and at the end of the 19th century, the women history almost changed, and the women's, earlier they were not allowed to work and they were not allowed to take part in the politics, but at the end of the 19th century, they were actively participating in the politics, and they were also working outside. So at the end of the 19th century, it was a complete change for the women living in the colonial period. I hope you liked my video. Please like, share and subscribe my channel, and also press the bell icon to get notifications of my future video. Thank you.